Hello there, and this one is called China, and I feel so inspired about this. Waited a long time to make this film. Just done my meditation and experienced the supreme luxury of doing it for 2 minutes rather than just the 60 seconds. So delightful, so blissful. China. My first experience of China, I was in grammar school in year 8, what people used to call the second year of secondary school. And in a history lesson, I did something that was very rare for me. Being an extremely introverted child, this was out of character. I put my hand up and I asked the history teacher a very simple question. I said, "When are we going to look at China, sir?" He was slightly surprised by the question. He said, "Oh, that's not on the syllabus." We're not going to look at China, ever. What a joke, isn't it? So that was my introduction to China, as people in the UK weren't even interested in anything about studying China at school level. So of course, like everything, that piqued my interest, which never went away. Second thing that happened for me is when I was 8, I was introduced to science fiction just by going to the library and seeing a book called The Domes of Mars and thinking, wow, that sounds interesting. That was it. Science fiction, lifelong thing. Well, this has given me a great advantage because decades before most people, I was aware of the significance of China because I'd read so many science fiction books which had predicted, speculated that actually in the future the prevailing power in terms of countries, of course, is China. Hardly surprising when you think about it. And yet most people are still acting like, well, China, what's the big deal? Well, this is where I want to introduce you to what little I know of, and bear in mind I know virtually nothing about China because I'm not Chinese and I've never been there. This is an outsider's perspective. Well, the next thing that happened to me when I was doing my health counselor's course and studying a health practice called macrobiotics, it became very clear that in terms of medicine the Chinese were way ahead, but like thousands of years ago. In fact, there's something called the Nei-Ching. It's a yellow Empress classic of internal medicine. And I got introduced to what is called the 5 transformations, also known as the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water. Completely different from 4 elements in the West. And I studied that in detail on my health counselor's course and realized, wow, this is an amazingly powerful tool. It's something I still work with today. So that was a big one. And then I came across a book when I was in my 20s. It was called Farmers of 40 Centuries. And that really brings a point home. You see, China has had, compared with other parts of the world, a relatively stable empire situation going on for 4,000 years. And one of the things this book points out is that the Chinese, for way more than 4,000 years, have shown great maturity in terms of handling the resources. So for example, historically in a city like Shanghai, you go back to the 19th century and before, people living in a city, well, guess what? Everyone in the city's got to go to the toilet just like anyone else. And so what they did is they had an organized system whereby all the human wastes, what we call wastes, actually isn't waste, was collected. So people's job was to go around with carts and collect everybody's human wastes. That's right, what comes out of your body. So all the shit got collected and taken out into the countryside and used. It got composted, and the compost was used to grow the crops that people grew to sustain their civilization. Because of course the other thing we know about China is it's always had, relatively speaking, a pretty large population. A lot of people need a lot of food, a lot of food needs a lot of fertility. In the days before chemical fertilizers, that's what you had. So very great intelligence in terms of use of human and natural resources. Whereas if you contrast that with Europe, well, We used to bury it deep underground in what were called composting toilets before we had so-called civilization, whereby you flush it down the pan and it goes out into a sewage system if you're lucky, or unlucky, it just goes straight into the sea to cause pollution in the sea. And that still happens today in the 21st century. That happens in the UK and other parts of the Western world. So there's all that, but I want you to bring you up to my more recent experience, which is forays into YouTube and Netflix. Because if you really want to get to know people, the best thing you can do is go and explore their fiction. And if you want to know even more about them, explore their historical fiction. So as soon as you show any interest in Chinese TV or films, the Netflix algorithm or the YouTube algorithm will start providing with what you're interested in. Of course, this is the way they work, isn't it? So the thing you begin to realize, there's a vast amount of information there. So I'm going to give you one which is on YouTube called The Butterfly Lovers. Now, The Butterfly Lovers is a really good exemplar of Chinese fiction in action in terms of TV and film, and there's a film version and there's a TV version. You can go and have a look for yourself. But what interested me, I did a little bit of research about this. The story of The Butterfly Lovers was taken by Marco Polo because he was so entranced by it. He brought it back to the West, and apparently that's what influenced Shakespeare to produce what is one of the most influential pieces of fiction in the Western world over the last 1,000 years, which of course is Romeo and Juliet. So how about that? So even Romeo and Juliet really originated from China. That should give you a bit of a clue about how worthwhile it is to research and explore about China. And then going over to Netflix, I particularly think of The Legend of the White Snake. That's one I came across last year and thoroughly enjoyed exploring. And then there's Yanxi Palace, which is one that I'm in the middle of at the moment. So that'll give you just a few little starting points. There's also another one called Empresses in the Palace. That's another one. And then I need to differentiate, because you might not know this. You've got Taiwan. Taiwan has its own media culture with films and TV, and then you've got mainland China with its own completely separate output too. So there's a huge amount to explore, and the more you explore, the more you start to realize what a fascinating civilization there is. And let's get to how it's affecting people in the everyday world. In the UK, we have pound shops, and in Europe they don't have pound shops. They have Chinese shops. That's what they call them. Now, the pound shops in the UK are selling all these cheap things. The Chinese shops in the European Union, they're not generally Euro shops, although I did notice in Bavaria that they had 2 Euro shops, but certainly in Spain, no, that's not the way they work. So the prices are not as cheap as the pound shops, which means they can provide a greater diversity of goods, but the point is everything is very low price. And what's really interesting about the Chinese shops in Europe, I noticed this particularly in Galicia, in Spain, but also in other parts of Spain too. You go in the Chinese shops, and behind the counter there's always a person of Chinese origin. Now that's a little bit interesting. So what a lot of countries have done, obviously the UK did this, and America is attempting to do it as well, which is they create an empire through conquest. They get the military together and they go in and beat the hell out of the local people. It's a really dumb approach, obviously, and all of these empires are doomed to failure. Now, the Chinese are doing nothing of the kind, because they do seem a lot more switched on. Having had a civilization that's been going on for more than 4,000 years, it means you can get a continuity. People can really build on their insights, like is done with the traditional Chinese medicine. I mean, acupuncture. Of course, acupuncture is well known in China, Japan and Korea, generally regarded to be originated in China, all relating to the 5 transformations, the meridians that run through the body, the energy centers. It's all fascinating stuff. So just take a little pause there for a moment. The way the Chinese Empire is in the process of expansion is not through military conquest, because that is so 20th century. The way to do it is through economic proliferation, and that is why you'll find that if you've got a mobile phone, it doesn't really matter whether it comes from a Chinese or a Korean or an American or a whatever country in the world country, because they're all made in China and Southeast Asia, aren't they? That's the deal. I mean, I've got an iPhone. Well, iPhones have always been made in China, I think, since they started. So that tells you a lot about the way the world really works. So what China has done is it's got economic dominance of the world, and anyone who studies about America quickly discovers that America went bankrupt way back in the 20th century. The people that own America really are other countries, and particularly thinking of Saudi Arabia, and we're thinking about the links with Israel, but far more than either of those two, it's really China. China's got massive investment in America. So it's a country to watch. Now I want to take you to Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary is regarded to be the forefather of LSD. He didn't synthesize the molecule, but he took it into world awareness. And he talked about all sorts of things in his books. And one of them, he talks about these waves, and these waves, they flow across the planet. And there was a particular time when the wave of development and creativity was really in the west coast of the USA. That's where it was. That's where all the new dynamics were coming from. And then it continued to sweep west across the Pacific Ocean, and it hit Japan first, and it's now hit Korea, and it's hitting China. So that's where the wave is traveling. The wave of innovation is traveling across the planet. So at the moment, if you want to watch what's going on, that's where you want to look. Now, as you know, I've watched a lot of Korean TV shows, a certain amount of Taiwanese and mainland Chinese, but Japanese as well. And one of the things I noticed, which was a really big kind of headbanger for me, it's like I was so out of date. I had no idea how far more in advance all these parts of the world are compared with Europe or America. They're way more advanced. And one of the things I started to notice is their phones can do all sorts of things that our phones don't do yet. So in terms of watching where the world is going, it's a part of the world we all need to become very familiar with, because we're in the process of having our entire cultures being taken over by this part of the world anyway. That's where the innovation is coming from. And then the other thing is, I had the great pleasure of meeting a bunch of Chinese people when I was in Sri Lanka, and I really like the energy of these people. They're just a bunch of random people being like me, a tourist in Sri Lanka. Love their energy. Felt really good about them. There's a sense of serenity, a sense of relative calmness, which you don't tend to see in the Americans and in the Europeans that I've known. So that was something else to note with significance. Yeah. So watch out what's going on in China. And the other thing is, this year there's a huge load of developments in China which will become really obvious at the end of 2020. But the point I want to make, and this is a nice little example, the Chinese have had a space program. Their space program's been going since the 1950s. You what? Well, we know about the Americans in the 60s, early 60s onwards, and we know about the Russians, but the Chinese decided to employ a much more intelligent approach. They didn't make a big drama about getting to the moon in 5 years. They didn't have this short-term thinking. They've got a very long-term game they're playing in terms of the way they're operating. And then a little link to my book, Sex Magic, the Guide. I make it really clear in that book that the Chinese aristocracy embraced and probably created sex magic and used sex magic to maintain a degree of stability which has not been seen in other parts of the world for more than 4,000 years. So again, we go to China for that one. And then the next thing is, I've just been reading a book, and it's about Africa, and it immediately brought back a memory when I was in Sri Lanka. Another way that economically the Chinese are colonizing the rest of the world is what they're doing is they are going into different countries, particularly third world countries, and they're going in and investing big time in infrastructure, road building and other kind of big scale building, shopping malls, new towns, new roads, new infrastructure, new factories, whatever. They are investing very, very large scale in all sorts of parts of the world. And I just remember driving along this tiny little road in Sri Lanka, and suddenly we just hit this roundabout, and there's this massive development. I thought I was in like the UK in the middle of a motorway building program or something like that. It's, whoa, yeah, okay, this is big. Big signs everywhere, funded by China. So my suggestion is, I mean, I have great respect to my brother. My brother learnt Mandarin ages ago. He could see the way things were going. So study China, and the easiest way, and I find the best way to get to know anything. And don't bother researching in terms of non-fiction. That is so old school. Much better to research through fiction, because that's how you get to study the consciousness of the people. And I personally find that historical fiction is even better, because when I'm looking at these programs all based around activities in the 21st century, it's great, and I get to realize, oh yeah, their technology is far advanced to ours. That's useful on a certain level, but this is why I understand the Chinese. When communism came, that was like a layer, a very superficial surface layer. Now what we've had since then, of course, communism is morphing into this very special brand of blend between communism and capitalism, and that's above the level of communism. And let's just make it clear, China embracing cryptocurrencies, embracing blockchain assets. As soon as I heard that, I realized, well, that's it, blockchain assets are here to stay, because the Chinese are embracing them. Until then it was a bit open really, but it's no longer a question. They are really here to stay now, blockchain assets, no question about it. So what I would say to you is that on this very superficial layer, you've got this blend of capitalism and communism. Beneath that you've got the communism, and beneath that you've got millennia of culture, of civilization. And if you want to really grasp what that's about, that's when you start to study the fiction. And I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And let's face it, there came a point for me a few years ago where watching something from America and UK output in TV and film is just so hackneyed. It's just so boring. They're just regurgitating the same old themes with such a minuscule amount of creativity that it's just great to be able to fall into and embrace a completely different culture, different way of looking at the world. So I thoroughly recommend you explore Chinese culture through fiction and bring yourself up to speed in what's going on. Thank you very much.